Good morning, class. This is ECON 353 Macroeconomics class. Today is March 29th, Tuesday.
As we'll finish up chapter 11 of the textbook, which is the money demand and money equilibrium. So here is the order of a video clip we are going to discuss today. 1. The price of a bond and the interest rate. 2. How the Fed changes money supply. 3. Investment demand. 4. The equilibrium in the money market. Here is the first video clip.
One last time, macroeconomic equilibrium. Savings equals investment. But how does it happen? Remember this famous equation. It came from the uses of your income and spending equals income, and voila, we've got the sum total of all savings in the economy is what's available for businesses to borrow if they want to build new factories, install equipment, and do other investment spending. And the thing that makes saving equal to investment is the adjustment of the interest rate, because the interest rate is the price of money, and we're talking here about financial markets, people saving, people borrowing. And this financial market, this investment spending, this interest rate story is the link between the financial system, money, interest-bearing assets, and the real economy, all of the spending that people do. So let's look at how this happens. Let's start with a diagram that we've drawn before. Here's the demand for loanable funds. This is businesses wanting to borrow money. And businesses want to borrow more money whenever the real interest rate is lower. And they want to borrow less money when the real interest rate is higher. That's because investment projects are profitable when you can borrow money at low rates. And investment projects are less profitable when you have to pay most of your profits to the bank. That is when the interest rate is high. Now, the other side of the story is the behavior of savers, that is the supply of loanable funds, and that's the blue curve. And it's upward sloping because households are willing to forego their consumption and put more of their income into savings whenever the reward for savings is higher. And if inflation is constant, you get a bigger real return on your savings when the nominal interest rate is higher. Now, we've already talked about this nominal interest rate, real interest rate problem. Everybody really cares about the real interest rate because the real interest rate is what determines the return on your project in the terms you care about, your purchasing power. So if the inflation rate is constant, we can talk about the nominal interest rate because the nominal interest rate and the real interest rate move one for one in the same direction when the inflation rate is held constant. So, for the moment, hold inflation constant and look at the behavior of businesses and the behavior of savers. And now we're ready to talk about equilibrium. Suppose we have an interest rate way down here. Suppose we call this interest rate 1. Maybe it's 5%. Well, at a very low interest rate, businesses are really eager to borrow money because a lot of investment projects are profitable if you can get the money at a low rate. On the other hand, if you look at the blue curve, people are not very interested in saving money whenever the return is so low. Therefore, there's an excess demand for loanable funds. Lots of businesses want to borrow, very few households want to save. So with this excess demand, businesses start competing aggressively to get money. They're willing to pay a higher interest rate. And whenever they pay this higher interest rate, then people are willing to save more money because the reward is higher. So the equilibrium interest rate is established as businesses bid higher and higher and higher interest rates to get funds. And whenever the businesses bid higher interest rates, some businesses decide to drop out of the bidding. They can't afford to pay those higher interest rates and still make a profit on their investment projects. So as the interest rate is bid up, we move along the red demand curve. That is, the quantity of loanable funds demanded shrinks. Over here, as the interest rate is bid up, households want to supply more loanable funds because the return is higher. Eventually, we reach a point to where an interest rate is established where the quantity of loanable funds demanded is equal to the quantity of loanable funds supplied. And we can call that, in this case, R0. This is the equilibrium interest rate in this market. The equilibrium interest rate at which the quantity of loanable funds demanded equals the quantity of loanable funds supplied. But look, the people supplying the funds are savers. The people borrowing the funds are businesses doing investment. So at this point where the blue and the red curves cross in equilibrium, savings equals investment. The adjustment of the interest rate helped us establish macroeconomic equilibrium. You get the same story if you start at an interest rate that's too high. If the interest rate I1 were way up here, then you'd have everybody wanting to save and fewer businesses wanting to borrow, an excess supply of loanable funds. So what would happen in this case is that savers would have to accept a lower interest rate if they wanted to get any kind of return on their money. So savers would start to bid against one another, agreeing to accept a lower interest rate rather than doing without any return at all. So then what happens is that as the interest rate falls, with savers being willing to accept a lower rate, more businesses want to borrow money. The interest rate continues to fall because of this excess supply of loanable funds until finally we return to the point at which savings equals investment. We're back at the equilibrium where the red curve and the blue curve cross. An interest rate at which the quantity of loanable funds demanded is equal to the quantity of loanable funds supplied. So there you have it, the usual story. Excess demand is eliminated by prices going up. Excess supply is eliminated by prices going down. The bidding mechanism establishes the equilibrium interest rate. The next step is to look at what would happen to the equilibrium interest rate if there were a change in the environment. That is, suppose something happens that causes either businesses to change their behavior at any given interest rate, or savers to change their behavior at any given interest rate. That is, a shift in one of the curves. Let's start with the demand side. Suppose now that the government gives businesses tax incentives to install new equipment. That is, some kind of government incentive to increase investment, like happened in President Reagan's administration in the early 1980s. Businesses were allowed to write off their investment expenditures faster through accelerated depreciation, and they got tax credits when they made new investments. The intent of this policy was to stimulate the economy, and indeed what happened was that businesses found it profitable to borrow more money so that they could install more equipment and build new factories. So the government incentives resulted in an increase in the demand for loanable funds. That is, businesses wanted to borrow more money at any given interest rate. So at the original interest rate now, what have we got? We're still on the blue curve because savers haven't changed their behavior. But now we've got this new red curve out here, so we've got excess demand. Businesses want to borrow a lot more money at this interest rate than savers want to save. So what happens? The bidding mechanism kicks in and interest rates begin to rise. Interest rates keep rising until we reach this new point of intersection between the new demand curve and the original supply curve. And that means after this accelerated depreciation, after these tax incentives to increase investment spending, what we get is a higher equilibrium interest rate and a larger quantity of investment spending. The financial markets expand as businesses try to borrow more money to take advantage of the opportunity created by favorable tax treatment of investment spending. Well, there you have it. Anything that shifts the demand curve out is going to push up the interest rate and cause financial activity to increase. Let's consider a possible change on the other side now. Suppose that the U.S. government decides to run a bigger deficit. So there's a bigger federal government budget deficit. In that case, what happens is the government now is saving less. And when the government saves less, then the total savings in the economy shrinks at any given interest rate. So with a decrease in government savings, total savings decreases, and the savings curve, the supply curve of loanable funds, shifts inward. Well, what's going to be the consequence? The consequence is, at the original interest rate, the quantity of loanable funds supplied is less than the quantity of loanable funds demanded on our original red demand curve. So, once again, we've got excess demand. And with excess demand, interest rates will be bid up. This time, however, the total amount of financial activity is going to be shrinking in the market. And what we get in equilibrium is I1, a smaller amount of overall investment, and a higher interest rate. This is what we call in macroeconomics crowding out. When the government comes into the financial system and borrows more money because it's running a bigger deficit, it crowds out business spending. It pushes up the interest rate, leaving less of the funds that are available for the business. When the government borrows more, there's less of the savings in the economy that's available for businesses to build factories with. Crowding out. An increase in the government budget deficit leads to a higher equilibrium interest rate and a lower overall amount of investment spending. So, any story you tell now, you can represent by a shift in either the demand curve for loanable funds or the supply curve for loanable funds. And whatever story you have, by shifting the curves appropriately, you can predict what will happen to the interest rate and the overall amount of business spending. Anyway, whatever the story, the economy adjusts, the interest rate adjusts until macroeconomic equilibrium is reestablished. And you know what that means. Savings equals investment.
The Federal Reserve has many roles, but its single most important responsibility is to control the nation's money supply. Remember that monetary policy is changes to the money supply in order to achieve particular macroeconomic goals, and in the U.S., the Fed controls monetary policy and the money supply. Making more money available, expansionary policy, makes it easier to spend, so aggregate demand increases. Making less money available, contractionary policy, makes it more difficult to spend, so aggregate demand falls. The question now is, how does the Fed control or make changes to the money supply? The Fed has three major tools to control the money supply. 1. Open market operations, or OMOs. 2. The required reserve ratio. 3. The discount rate. How does each of these work, and which tool or tools does the Fed prefer? Let's take them one at a time. 1. Open market operations. Just as with fiscal policy, monetary policy can be either expansionary, stimulating the economy, or contractionary, slowing the economy. If open market operations are the buying and selling of government securities, which is expansionary and which is contractionary? Let's look at an example of an open market purchase, where the Fed buys $1 million of securities, or government bonds, from Wells Fargo. The Fed sees a change in its asset mix as it increases its holdings of securities and decreases its holdings of cash, depositing $1 million into Wells Fargo's account. Wells Fargo also sees a change in its asset mix, with $1 million less in government securities but $1 million more on deposit with the Fed. The big difference is that $1 million in securities can't be loaned out, but $1 million in bank reserves, or at least some fraction of it, can be lent out. With the open market purchase, the Fed has injected $1 million into the economy, plus whatever additional effect from the lending of the excess reserves, making this expansionary policy. What about an open market sale? Let's say that the Fed sells $1 million of government securities to Bank One. The Fed sees a decrease in its holdings of securities, but Bank One pays the Fed $1 million. Actually, the Fed just deducts the amount from Bank One's Federal Reserve deposits. Bank One now has $1 million less on deposit at the Fed. That's $1 million less in actual bank reserves, but has $1 million more in securities. What this means is that Bank One now has less money to lend, and less money in circulation means less spending, slowing down the economy. Therefore, an open market sale is contractionary monetary policy. What about the second tool, the required reserve ratio? We've seen this one in action already when we examined how the banking system creates money, but let me recap. Recall that the maximum change in checkable deposits, and therefore the money supply, is 1 over the required reserve ratio times the initial change in reserves. For example, if the change in reserves is $500 and the required reserve ratio, that is, the percentage of total deposits that the bank is legally required to hold on to, is 10%, then the maximum change in the money supply is 1 over 0.1 times 500, or 10, the money multiplier, times 500, or $5,000. Now, what if the Fed increases the required reserve ratio to 20%? Technically, according to the Monetary Control Act of 1980, the Fed is only allowed a range from 8% to 14%, but let's just use 20% hypothetically. It makes the math easier. What's going to be the new maximum possible change in the money supply? With a required reserve ratio of 0.2, that's 20%, the multiplier is now 1 over 0.2, or 5. So the maximum change is 5 times $500, or $2,500. This means that raising the reserve requirement is contractionary monetary policy, since the overall possible change is half what it was before, slowing the economy. This makes sense, since a higher reserve ratio means that banks are legally required to hold on to more reserves, leaving less to lend out. What if the Fed decreases the reserve requirement to 5%? Now the multiplier, 1 over R, or 1 over 0.05, is 20, so a $500 change in reserves can make up to a $10,000 difference in the money supply. Decreasing the required reserve ratio makes more money available for lending, thereby increasing spending in the economy and expansionary monetary policy. The third tool, the discount rate, is the interest rate at which commercial banks can borrow from the Fed. This one is pretty common sense. At a higher interest rate, banks are less inclined to borrow, which slows the economy, or contractionary policy. At a lower interest rate, banks are more inclined to borrow, putting more money in circulation and stimulating the economy, expansionary policy. Here's the kicker though. Sometimes, even at very attractive rates, banks don't want to borrow from the Fed. To borrow money, a bank can go to other commercial banks or they can go to the Fed. Borrowing from other banks means entering the federal funds market and being subject to the federal funds rate, the interest rate that banks charge each other. Borrowing from the Fed means paying the discount rate, or the rate at which the Fed lends to member banks. Which will the borrowing bank choose? You'd think it would be the lower interest rate, wouldn't you? Well, oddly enough, even if the discount rate is less than the federal funds rate, a bank still may go to the federal funds market for the loan. Why? Well, for a few reasons, really. First, there's the purpose of the loan. That is, the Fed frowns on making loans for risky profit ventures. Second, consider the Fed bureaucracy. Among the functions of the Fed, one is to supervise member banks. Do you want to ask your supervisory entity for a loan, or multiple loans? Borrowing too often from the Fed might look like bad management, opening your bank up to an audit. Third, there's the fact that borrowing from the Fed is a privilege, not a right for member banks. If you abuse the privilege, you may be turned down in the future. For all of these reasons, the Fed is referred to as the lender of last resort. So which tool, OMOs, the required reserve ratio, or the discount rate, does the Fed prefer to use? The Fed tends to use open market operations the most for several reasons. 1. OMOs are flexible. The Fed can conduct sales or purchases in any dollar amount that they want. 2. OMOs are reversible. If the Fed conducts an open market purchase today, it can turn right around and conduct an open market sale tomorrow. 3. Quick implementation. Fed OMOs take place very rapidly as transactions occur electronically. You've seen the discount rate drawback. Many banks prefer not to borrow from the Fed unless absolutely necessary. And changing the required reserve ratio is like trying to use a sledgehammer on the economy. In the end, the Fed prefers to try fine-tuning the economy with OMOs. Next time, exchange.
Hello, class. So today we're going to work on Chapter 30, which is Money Growth and Inflation. And we're going to see how money supply affects inflation and nominal interest rates. And we're also going to see whether money supply affects real variables like the real GDP or real interest rates that we covered before. And then we're going to see a little bit how is inflation like a tax and what are the costs of inflation. So first, let's talk about the value of money. And this is one thing that we're first going to show using a graph how money can affect the price level. So let's say P is the general price level. And like the basket of goods that we measured using to find out CPI. And it's measured using some dollar value. So this 1 over P is the value of a dollar, which is measured in goods. So for example, if the basket contains a candy bar, then if price is $2 of that candy bar, then with $1 you can buy half a candy bar. If the price rises to $3, now with $1 you can only purchase a third of a candy bar. So as the price of the basket goes up,
your dollar can purchase a smaller fraction of that basket. So increase in prices is basically inflation. So whenever inflation goes up, prices go up, and our dollar, the dollar we earn, is able to purchase fewer and fewer goods. So next we come to the quantity theory of money. This was first developed by many different economists actually, but one of the persons who actually formulated it was David Hume, who lived in, I believe, England in the 18th century. And later it was advocated by Milton Friedman, who was a Nobel Prize winner in economics, and he used to teach at the University of Chicago. And this basically says that the quantity of money determines the value of money. So if there are more money floating around, then we don't value it as much. And so the value of money falls. If there's less money, then we value that money a lot since the quantity is less, and so the value of money is more. Now we're going to study this using two approaches, a supply and demand approach that we're going to use first, and then using an equation. So first let's look at the money supply. In the real world, money supply is determined by mainly the Fed. As we said, Fed determines how much money is circulated in the economy. The banking system, by giving out loans, can determine money supply, and consumers. If we hold more money as cash, then there's the money multiplier will not work as much. But if the consumers hold less money as cash and put all the money in their banks, then there's a lot more money multiplier action going on, and so money supply then can increase. In this model, we're going to assume that the Fed actually knows exactly how much money it wants to control, or how much money it wants to have circulating in the economy. So it fixes a certain fixed amount, that this is how much the money I want to be circulating, and then does exactly a certain few steps to get that, achieve that goal. So on the other hand, let's see money demand. Money demand is how much money people want to hold in the most liquid form. That is, as close to cash as possible. Now it depends upon the price level. If prices go up, then that reduces the value of money, because now we need more money to do our daily transactions. We need more money to buy our groceries or buy our gas, and so we can't save all our money in a savings account or in an investment fund. We have to use that money for our daily consumption. So the quantity of money demanded is negatively related to the value of money and positively related to the price. So if price goes up, we need to hold more money. But if price goes up, the value of money goes down. So as the value of money goes down, we need to hold more cash. Other things being equal, other things are like, your real income. If your income goes up, then that's a different story. Then you can actually save more money. If there are more ATMs in your area, then you don't need to carry as much cash. You can just go, whenever you need ATM money, you just go to the nearest ATM and withdraw cash. Now, if we look at the money supply and demand diagram, on this side we have the value of money. So let's look at this. If this is the price level, of course, if price level is 2, then the value of money is 1 over 2. And that's how we get that number. If price level rises to 4, so here it's rising, then the value of money is 1 over 4. So as value of money goes up, then our price level falls if the value of money goes up. If price level goes up, then the value of money falls. So the Fed sets some value of money, some money supply, and it's fixed. So let's say it's fixed at $1,000. So if money supply or if money demand, we know, should be downward sloping. Why? Because as value of money increases, we need to hold less money. So quantity of money demanded will decrease. So the intersection of demand and supply basically determines the equilibrium value of money. And when we find the reciprocal of that, we get the equilibrium price level. Now, supposing the Fed increases money supply, okay, if the Fed thinks that, we need more money, then money supply will go up. Now, if that happens, well, the new equilibrium point is point B. Now, if there's more money, if you think about it intuitively, if there's a lot of money floating around, then the actual value of a dollar will not be as high, because now if sellers think that if there's a region, people have more money to spend, then they're going to start charging a higher price. So when that happens, prices go up, and of course the value of money will go down. So as we see that, if money supply goes up, the value of money falls, and the price, general price level, goes up. Why does this happen? Short version is, at initial price, so supposing the sellers don't know that money supply increased, an increase in money supply, of course, will cause an excess supply of money. Then people start get rid of their excess money by spending it or by loaning it to others. If I can't spend it, I save it in the bank, and the bank will give it to someone else for spending. As a result, what happens is the demand for goods goes up. So if we recall from chapter 4, people are having more money, their income is going up, so demand curve will shift to the right. But supply does not increase accordingly, because sellers are like, well, this, at first they might increase quantity supply, but then they're like, well, this much, it's just money is a piece of paper, it doesn't have any value. So people are just spending money, not because they're wealthy, it's because they just have some extra pieces of paper. So other things happen in the short run, and actually we don't have time for studying them, but in macro theory, if you're interested, next semester, you can take macro theory, and they'll talk about what happens in the short run if money supply goes up. There could be some positive benefits, but this, in the long run, it doesn't have any effect. So nominal variables are variables using monetary units. So we talked about nominal GDP, nominal interest rates, and nominal wage, which is just basically how much you get paid per hour of work. So currently the minimum wage is $7.25 an hour, so that is nominal wage. Real variables, on the other hand, are measured in physical units. So real GDP was one. We kept prices constant, and then we measured how much more does a country produce. We talked about real interest rates, where we said that nominal interest rate minus the rate of inflation gives us the real interest rate. And real wage is measured in output. So basically, how much, if I work an extra hour, how much more can I purchase? So prices are usually measured in terms of money. So we always have prices measured in dollar values, $5 or $10 or $7.59, something like that. Let's say price of a CD is $15. Price of a pepperoni pizza is $10. A relative price is the price of one good relative to or divided by another good. So relative price of CD in terms of pizza would be 1.5 CDs per pizza, which means that if we look at that number, so we're saying that, okay, one pizza costs $10. If instead, if I wanted to purchase one CD instead of a pizza, I have to give up the consumption of 1.5 pizzas if I wanted to purchase one CD. So if we think pizza is a currency, because if we looked at money, money has fiat value. It doesn't have any kind of value in it, embedded in it. But pizza, let's say, it does have some value in it. So if I were using pizza as a currency, I would be using 1.5 pizzas to buy one CD. And so that's relative price. So if we have relative price, we can use any products, dollar value as relative price. I had a friend, whenever we used to go out to eat or watch a movie, he would measure everything in terms of the price of a 7-layer burrito. So he would be like, okay, well, if I go to the movies, and this was in Kentucky, so like price of a ticket was $7. A 7-layer burrito back in the day was like at 80 cents. So he would divide that and he would be like, well, I could purchase around 10 or 15 burritos with that price of a movie ticket and Coke. Is it worth going or not? So he would convert everything to something that he thought has stable value and then would measure according to that. Measure everything else's value according to that product, although it's a $7 burrito. But he used to do that. So that's what we're doing here too. We're saying that we're measuring the value of a CD in terms of how much pizzas do we have to give up. So relative prices are measured using physical units, so there are real variables. We have something very concrete here, trying to, in this case, pizza, that has a certain value. So we're measuring the value of other products using that of using the pizza. An important relative price is real wage. So nominal wage just tells us the dollar value. Okay, you're supposing you work $15 an hour. That's your nominal wage. Let's say the price level of a product, let's say a burger, is $5 per unit. So real wage is how much more can you purchase of a burger if you worked 1 extra hour. So in this case, you would just divide 15 by 5, and so you would get 3 units. So if you worked 1 extra hour, you can purchase 3 more burgers. So instead of saying like, oh yeah, if I work 1 extra hour, I'll get $15 extra, you just say I will get 3 extra units of burgers. Now, here's the difference between classical dichotomy and that tells us the difference between real and nominal variables. It says that human other classical economists believe that when you increase the supply of money, it affects nominal variables, but it doesn't affect real variables. Now, what do they mean by that? So if you increase money supply, nominal GDP will go up, but real GDP won't. If you increase money supply, then nominal wages will go up, but real wages won't. So why? Because if central bank doubles money supply, Hume and other classical contenders or thinkers believe that all nominal variables will go up by the same amount as the increase in money supply, but all real variables will remain unchanged. And this is known as the neutrality of money, that money does not affect real variables. So doubling money supply causes all nominal prices to double. So why does relative prices doesn't change? Let's look at the relative price of CDs in terms of pizza. Initially, it was $15 per CD and $10 per pizza. So who wanted to exchange CDs with pizza? We needed 1.5 pizzas for 1 CD. Now, if we increase money supply, if we double money supply, then all the prices in the economy will double. So CDs now will become $30. Price of pizza will become $20. So yes, the prices went up, but that relative exchange, how much pizzas do you have to give up to buy a CD, stays the same. So the relative price remains unchanged if you increase money supply and all the prices go up by the same amount. Similarly, real wages don't change, because if you increase wages and prices go up by the same percentage, then you just are able to purchase the same quantity before and after the price increase. So in this case, the quantity of labor does not change. Of course, if you are able to purchase the same amount as before, you're not going to work harder. Quantity demanded of labor won't change because firms won't hire more workers because demand hasn't changed. Prices of all the products went up by the same amount. So total employment doesn't change. So the same idea applies to employment of capital and other resources. So since employment doesn't change at all, so total output remains unchanged by the money supply. So nothing really changes, and that's what classical economists believe. If you increase money supply, it doesn't affect any real variables. It affects nominal variables. Prices go up, but since all prices go up, including wages, so none of the real variables change. Now, most economists believe that the classical dichotomy and the neutrality of money, these principles, they describe the economy in the long run. In the later chapters, so we do talk about a little bit about short-run effects, but since we don't have much time in this course, so in macro theory, you will learn what happens in the short run. If you increase money supply, there may be some effect on certain real variables, but in the long run, that effect disappears. Now, we talked about the first one we looked at the quantity theory of money in terms of a graph. Now here we're going to look at it in terms of an equation. So we're coming up with this notion called velocity of money. The velocity of money is the rate at which money changes hands in a given year. So let's put in some notation. P we know as price. Y we have used before as real GDP. So P times Y gives us nominal GDP. It's basically converting real GDP to how much money today do you have to spend to purchase Y units of output. Let's say M is the money supply, and let's say V is the velocity. So the velocity is telling us if M is the money supply, then how much money, or how many times does money have to change hands in order to purchase P times Y amount of nominal GDP. So let's look at with some numbers. Supposing there's just one good, pizza. We just have one product. And let's say that in a given year, we produce 3,000 pizzas. Let's say the price of each pizza is $10. So we need $30,000 of money, of transactions to buy 3,000 units of pizzas. But let's say the money supply, the total amount of dollars that we have in the economy is $10,000. So we can't purchase, if we wanted to purchase all the pizza at the same time, we wouldn't have enough money to do that. Okay, so what we need to do is, well, if we divide that amount, so basically 30,000 divided by 10,000, which is 3, which means that let's say each of those $10,000 is in a $10 denomination. Then we're using that $10 to purchase one pizza, and then that $10 moves around 3 times in the economy, so that finally all $30,000 worth of pizza are traded in the market. There may be demand for 30,000 pizzas, but the money supply is not enough to cover all the transactions. What the velocity of money tells us is, in order for all the pizzas to be sold, all 3,000 pizzas at $10 per pizza, if we have $10,000 of money floating around, then each dollar has to move on an average 3 times, has to change hands, has to be in 3 different transactions for all the pizzas to be sold. So here again, average dollar was used in 3 transactions. Now if we plot these values over time, we see the velocity of money doesn't change much at all. It's very relatively constant. M2 measure, we talked about M2 money supply and nominal GDP. They pretty much go up hand in hand until 1990. Then they kind of deviated, but they have an upward trend. So velocity of money is fairly stable over time. So if we look at this, and another way of writing this formula is if we multiply both sides by m, we get mv equals p times y. This is called the quantity equation of money. What this is telling us is that v is stable over time, so v doesn't really change. So any change in money supply, if we increase m, it causes nominal GDP, which is p times y, to change by the same percentage. So if money supply goes up by 50%, if v doesn't change, then, well, left-hand side must equal right-hand side, so P times Y must go up by 50% too. According to classical economists, a change in money supply does not affect Y because money is neutral, and Y, which is our productivity or GDP measure, depends upon technology and the resources available in the economy. So, like what we talked about, human capital, physical labor, physical capital, and natural resources that we talked about, and the level of technology in the economy. So if Y is not affected, then any change in money supply will just increase P. So if we look at this, if we increase money supply, this doesn't change. Classical economists believe this doesn't change. So any increase in M will only increase P by the same amount. So rapid money supply growth will cause rapid inflation. If we increase money supply by 100%, all it will do is increase prices by 100%. Hyperinflation. Hyperinflation is generally defined as inflation exceeding $50 or 50% per month. We talked about this principle way back in time, is that prices rise when government prints too much money. So whenever money grows a lot, whenever there is excessive growth in money supply, that always causes hyperinflation. The recent one we saw was in Zimbabwe. So large government deficits have created huge amount of money and have actually created very, very high inflation rates. So if we look at the price of US dollar in terms of Zimbabwe dollars, so US dollars price is relatively stable when you compare it with Zimbabwe dollars. We see that like over time, like literally within 6 or 7 months, price of the exchange rate of one Zimbabwe dollars to US dollars. So if you sold one US dollar, you would get 245 Zimbabwe dollars. By July of 2008, it rose to 26 billion. So there was a huge effect of inflation. And you had Zimbabwe dollars were being used in different ways other than in transactions. So people lost complete faith in their money. They would not use it to do transaction because there was no reason to do it. So if governments print a lot of money, and this happened not only in Zimbabwe, it happened in Israel, it happened in a lot of the Latin American countries like Peru and Brazil. It happened in Israel in the 1980s, in the Weimar Republic, which was the precursor to Germany in the 1920s. So inflation is like a tax. When tax revenue is inadequate, when governments don't have enough taxes coming in for expenditure, government may just print more money to pay for its spending. And almost all hyperinflation start this way, when governments start printing money without telling people that they're printing money to pay their expenses. Excuse me, because printing money doesn't really require any cost. And so when governments start doing that, well, at first people don't realize it, but then once people realize that, wait, money is just being printed by the government, it's not really the result of creation of wealth. So all it does is increase prices. The revenue from printing money is called inflation tax. Because printing money causes inflation, which is a tax on everyone who holds money. Because if I hold $500 in my savings account, because the government printed money and reduced the value of money, my $500 in the bank will not purchase $500 worth of goods anymore. They will purchase something less, probably about a lesser value. Let's say $500 would purchase 500 loaves of bread. Next year, it's probably going to purchase just 490 loaves of bread. So that is like a tax to me, since I am not being able to purchase the same amount of goods. Excuse me. So it's like the government is taking away the value of money from me without literally taking away physical units of money from me. So in the US, the average around inflation is around 2 to 3% a year. So inflation tax in the US is about 3% of total revenue. What are the costs of inflation? Well, one is called shoe leather costs. It is because people, and I'm not sure why it's called shoe leather costs, but it's basically, it's the waste of resources that you have to do because inflation doesn't let people hold more money. So you want to hold less money and you want to just go and spend the money because it's better to buy goods than actually hold the money. So basically, if your money gets deposited in the bank, you have to make frequent bank travels or go to your bank to withdraw the money or go to the nearest ATM to withdraw the money. So that's actually an opportunity cost because you're wasting your time, your resources. The bank has to pay the additional fee for your processing of your checks and ATMs. So all those things add up, and those are a waste of resources. The other is called menu cost. It's a cost of changing prices. So think about it, if you have a store like Walmart, if prices go up, you have to go and change the price of every single item on the store. If you have a store like Amazon, you have to update the prices every single month or every 6 months if inflation goes up very frequently. Or if you think about a restaurant, you have to print new menus. Well, no one really, catalogs aren't mailed as much, but you can think about it, catalogs need to be updated and mailed by stores and all those things. So those are costs, and those are borne by the firm. So if inflation is high, then these costs are also pretty high. So that's all we have for Chapter 30. Chapter 30 is done. Hope you have
The last thing that I'm going to mention in this series is something known as the quantity theory of money. The quantity theory of money is simply this proposition that, in the long run, an increase in the quantity of money brings an equal percentage increase in the price level. A couple of important mathematical items that we need to cover. First, I'm going to define velocity of circulation. Velocity of circulation is the average number of times that a dollar of money is used annually to buy the goods and services that make up GDP. The inflation rate can be calculated as the money growth rate plus the rate of velocity change minus the real GDP growth rate. But in the long run, the velocity of circulation equals 0. So in the long run, we can calculate the inflation rate as the money growth rate minus the real GDP growth rate. And normally, if you see any questions on your exams, you'll normally be given these values, and so you just really need to remember this equation, and you can simply calculate whichever variable is being asked of you. That was the series on money.
Lesson will explore the different tools of monetary policy available to a nation's central bank for managing the level of interest in the economy and therefore influencing the level of aggregate demand. In a previous lesson, we introduced the money market, which we see here. The money supply curve represents the total supply of liquid money in a nation's economy. This refers to cash, checkable deposits, and savings accounts. The money demand curve represents the demand for money as an asset and as a medium of exchange with which to buy output or the goods produced in a nation's economy. In the same previous lesson, we also mentioned that the supply of money is not related to the interest rate. Rather, it is determined by the monetary policy of a nation's central bank. First, let's look at what we have here in this illustration we're going to use today. We've got the United States Federal Reserve, which is represented by the chairman of the Federal Reserve, Ben Bernanke. Now, the Federal Reserve is the entire green box at the top of the screen. Within the Federal Reserve system, we have money, represented by $100 bills, and we have U.S. government bonds, represented by this orange bond certificate that you see here. Now, government bonds play a very important role in monetary policy, as we'll see when we talk about OMO, or open market operations. Next, let's look at the commercial banks. Of course, most of the money in a nation is held not by households as a physical asset, rather in bank accounts, either savings accounts or checking accounts. So commercial banks, which we see in this corner, hold money as an asset, and they hold bonds as an asset. Now, the money held at commercial banks actually belongs to households. So that brings us to the households. In households, we see that, yes, money is earned in the resource market from our circular flow model in Unit 1 of the course, and bonds are also held. Now, government bonds are a form of asset that households can invest in as a way to save money, just like putting money in a bank can be used for savings. So even though we're talking about monetary policy here, government bonds play a very important role. Government bonds are an illiquid form of asset. Government bonds, unlike money, cannot be used to buy goods or services. Therefore, if the central bank wishes to increase the supply of money, they can buy up some of the government bonds from households and commercial banks in exchange for liquid money, which can then lead to more consumption and investment in the economy. Now let's go back to the Fed and start talking about the different tools that the Federal Reserve or any central bank has for either increasing or decreasing the supply of money in the nation's economy. We'll start with the tool known as the reserve requirement. Okay, another term for this is the required reserve ratio. So sometimes it's known as RRR, the required reserve ratio. Now, this is defined as the percentage of a bank's total deposits from households that must be kept on reserve at the Federal Reserve Bank. Now, let's do an actual example here. If a commercial bank, that is a private bank, has total deposits equaling $1 billion, in other words, households have saved $1 billion at that bank, and the reserve requirement equals 0.2, this tells us that 20% of that $1 billion must be kept on reserve at the Fed. So this should mean that of the $1 billion, $200 million would be kept in reserve at the Fed. So what could the Federal Reserve, what could a central bank do to the reserve requirement to increase the supply of money? This is quite simple. In fact, lowering the reserve requirement, let's say the reserve requirement falls to 0.1. Now, commercial banks must keep only 10% of total deposits at the Fed. If the reserve requirement decreases, what this does is this frees up some of these reserves from the Fed and brings them back into the banking system. Decreasing the reserve requirement means that commercial banks can lend out a greater proportion of their total reserves, which leads to an increase in the supply of money and a decrease in the equilibrium interest rate. So this would be considered an expansionary monetary policy. Reducing the reserve requirement allows more money from households' deposits to be kept at commercial banks and not at the Fed. Now, money stored at the Fed, money that is required to be kept at the Fed, cannot be lent out by commercial banks. Therefore, a lower reserve requirement means that there is more money available to be lent out by commercial banks. Therefore, the increase in the supply of liquid money in the economy brings down the costs of borrowing and makes more money available to lend to households, firms, and other borrowers to help pay for consumption and investment. Reducing the reserve requirement is one type of expansionary monetary policy. Now let's go back to the original reserve requirement of 0.2. What if the central bank wished to decrease the supply of money? One way it could do that is by raising the reserve requirement from 0.2 to 0.4 or 0.3 or 0.25. Now this means that of their total deposits from households, commercial banks must now keep 40% of those deposits on reserve. So banks now have to send more of their total reserves to the Fed, which takes that money out of circulation. There is now less liquid money available in the economy, causing the money supply to decrease, as we see here. And the increased scarcity of money in the banking system causes the interest rate in the economy to rise. Commercial banks will now charge higher interest rates to borrowers. Therefore, there will be less money available for loans to households, reducing the level of consumption and investment in the economy. Raising the reserve requirement puts upward pressure on interest rates since commercial banks have to store more of their total deposits at the Federal Reserve, taking that money out of circulation and reducing the money supply, raising the interest rate. Historically, the reserve requirement in the United States has rarely been changed. Most recently, it stands at around 10% or 0.1. In other words, commercial banks in the United States must keep 10% of their total deposits from households on reserve at the central bank. So the reserve requirement is a relatively unused tool of monetary policy. Let's move on to the next one though. OMO, this stands for Open Market Operations. This is in fact the most regularly used tool of monetary policy by the United States Fed. This involves the US Fed either buying bonds or selling bonds from commercial banks and households in order to increase or decrease the supply of money in the economy. Typically, the Federal Reserve will meet quarterly, once every few months, to determine whether or not it will buy bonds, sell bonds, or maintain the level of bonds that it currently holds. Now, what's the importance of bonds? As we said earlier, bonds are an illiquid asset. Bonds are investments held by households and commercial banks that earn interest, but they cannot be spent on goods and services. So if the Federal Reserve decides to buy bonds from households, what would that look like in our illustration here? To buy bonds, the Federal Reserve will give liquid cash, as we see here, in exchange for illiquid bonds. So bonds will go into the Federal Reserve from commercial banks and from households. If they wish to continue to increase the supply of money, they can continue to buy bonds from the public. For every $100 bill inserted into the economy, a $100 government bond is withdrawn. Now, as we can predict, an increase in the bond purchases by the Federal Reserve will lead to an increase in the supply of liquid money. So our supply of money curve would shift out, and since there's more liquidity in the system now, the equilibrium interest rate will fall and borrowing costs will decrease. It's very visual in our illustration here. As the Fed buys bonds from the public, from commercial banks and households, it takes an illiquid asset out of circulation and injects money into the economy. Recall, money held at the Fed is not part of the money supply since it can't be borrowed or spent by private individuals. However, as soon as money is injected into the commercial banking system and into the hands of American households, there is now more money to be spent. This will lead to economic stimulus. Households will be able to borrow money at cheaper costs. They will have more liquid money at their disposal. Therefore, they will go shopping. They will spend more of that money. So buying bonds is considered an expansionary monetary policy. When the Fed engages in an open market purchase of government bonds from the public, it leads to an increase in the money supply and a decrease in the interest rate, and ultimately an increase in aggregate demand of the economy. So what if the Federal Reserve, what if the central bank wanted to contract the level of aggregate demand in the economy? What type of open market operation could be used to reduce the supply of money, cause interest rates to rise, and therefore lead to less aggregate demand? Well, predictably, if buying bonds increases the supply of money, then in fact it is selling government bonds that decreases the supply of money. Let's show how that would look in our illustration here. If the Federal Reserve started to sell bonds to commercial banks, then we would see money flow from commercial banks to the Fed in exchange for illiquid bonds. There is now less money in commercial banks to be loaned to households. In addition, if the Fed sells bonds to households, we're going to see bonds go into the pockets of households and money come out of the pockets of households. There is now less money in circulation in the economy. Therefore, the level of consumption and investment falls. A sale of government bonds by the Fed decreases the money supply, as we see here, and causes the interest rate in the economy to rise, as we see here. This is called a contractionary monetary policy. It is very regularly used in order to bring down inflation in the economy. Now, why does a sale of bonds bring down inflation? Because less money means less overall spending, less aggregate demand, therefore less pressure on prices in the economy. So why do households and commercial banks buy bonds when the Fed decides to sell them? It's quite simple. A $100 government bond that matures in 10 years might be able to be bought for $90 currently. That would give you an effective interest rate of just over 10%. In other words, you could buy a $100 bond for $90, wait 10 years, and get $10 more than you paid for it. However, if the Fed goes to sell those bonds on the open market, the supply of them would increase, and whenever the supply of any asset increases, the price of it falls. Now you may be able to buy that same $100 bond for only $80. This would give you an effective interest rate of almost 25%. Since an $80 investment now could lead to a $100 payment in the future. When the Fed sells bonds, the price of government bonds falls, and investors find them more attractive since the effective interest rate on those government bonds increases. This is called a contractionary monetary policy. So we've just gone through open market operations now. If the Federal Reserve wishes to increase the money supply, they will buy bonds. As we see, bonds will be sent to the Fed, money will be put in commercial banks, money will be given to households in exchange for bonds, and the supply of money increases, causing the interest rate in the economy to fall. On the other hand, if the Fed wishes to decrease the supply of money in the economy, they can sell bonds, in which case money would be given back to the Fed by commercial banks, and money would be given back to the Fed by households. There is now less money in circulation, causing interest rates to rise, decreasing the level of consumption and investment. So that brings us to our final tool of monetary policy. The final tool of monetary policy is known as the discount rate. The discount rate is defined as the interest rate on short-term loans from the Federal Reserve to commercial banks. Now, why would a commercial bank want to borrow money from the Federal Reserve? Wouldn't a bank prefer to borrow from another bank in the economy? Generally speaking, yes, but the Federal Reserve is known as the lender of last resort. If a commercial bank, for example, at the end of a given day, does not have enough to meet its reserve requirement, it could be in violation of a federal law. Now, typically, a bank will not violate the law. It will simply borrow some of the money it needs from the Fed in order to meet its required reserve ratio. So if the Federal Reserve lowers the interest rate that it charges banks for these short-term loans, this would make it cheaper for commercial banks to borrow funds from the Fed. So we would see the supply of money in the banking system increase, which, as we now know, causes the equilibrium interest rate to decrease. Reducing the discount rate makes it cheaper for banks to borrow money from the Federal Reserve, which makes it cheaper for households to borrow money from banks. So the discount rate, again, is the interest rate charged by the Fed for loans to commercial banks. On the other side, if the Federal Reserve wished to decrease the money supply, they could simply raise the discount rate. Now, this would obviously make it more expensive for commercial banks to borrow from the Fed. Therefore, the supply of money would be less. Fewer commercial banks would be willing to make risky loans because it would cost them more to borrow money to make up their required reserves from the Fed. So the discount rate is the final tool of monetary policy. This is typically not used in an active fashion very frequently. The most commonly used tool of monetary policy is definitely open market operations. In a given year, a Fed may change its open market operations policy 3 or 4 times. It may decide to buy bonds if it wishes to stimulate aggregate demand, although if inflation becomes a threat, it may begin selling bonds to decrease the money supply. So during recessions, the Federal Reserve or any central bank will engage in expansionary monetary policy consisting of bond purchases. Buying bonds directly from commercial banks and from households increases the supply of money and leads to increases in consumption and investment. During periods of inflation, a central bank will more likely sell bonds to households and commercial banks. This decreases the supply of money, puts upward pressure on interest rates, and reduces the level of consumption and investment in the economy. So that wraps up this lesson on monetary policy and the 3 tools of monetary policy. In a later lesson, we'll actually bring an aggregate demand, aggregate supply model into our analysis, and we'll show more precisely how different monetary policies lead to changes in the level of investment and consumption, and therefore employment, economic growth, and the price level in the economy.
Let's move on and talk about how a country's central bank goes about conducting monetary policy. There are three tools that a central bank has at its disposal. There is a catch though, and that catch is that the central bank must choose one tool. It cannot manipulate all three at the same time. The monetary base is essentially the quantity of money flowing within the economy. It can also manipulate the exchange rate. But the most interesting tool of choice, and the one which I will be emphasizing, is something known as the overnight loans rate. The overnight loans rate is the interest rate on overnight loans that banks make to each other. At the end of the day, when all transactions have been made, banks need to actually transfer money into each other's reserve accounts according to how much their customers have spent. If I buy something from Metro, my local grocery store, using my debit card, my bank must transfer money into Metro's bank account. But say Metro has its banking accounts at a different bank. In this case, my bank must send money to the other bank. Sometimes banks do not have enough reserves to send money over to other banks. In this case, they take out what is known as an overnight loan. An overnight loan is exactly what it sounds like. It's a loan that is paid back by the next day. Let's see how the central bank manipulates this thing known as the overnight loans rate. The first thing I want to mention about this graph is that it shows the relationship between the overnight loans rate and the bank reserves that are held at the central bank. For the purposes of this graph, we're going to assume that the zero axis is a bit further to the right than on other graphs. We'll assume that at the gray line, there are zero reserves at the central bank. Let's say that the central bank puts its target overnight loans rate at some arbitrary number. It now needs to manipulate the market in order to achieve this target. The central bank uses two other interest rates to do this. The bank rate is the rate that the central bank charges big banks on overnight loans. This is always set at 0.25% above the target overnight rate. The bank rate acts like a maximum overnight loans rate because if a bank wants to borrow at a lower rate from another bank, it will not borrow from the central bank. In addition, no bank would charge higher than the bank rate because no bank would borrow the money from it if the central bank's rate is less. In essence, the bank rate acts as a cap, or a maximum that the overnight loans rate can be at any given time. The settlement balances rate is the interest rate that a central bank pays on reserves held in its accounts, and it is set at 0.25% below the target overnight loans rate. It acts as an absolute maximum value that the overnight loans rate could take. Banks wouldn't make overnight loans to other banks unless they earned a higher interest rate than what the central bank is offering as a rate of return in its reserves. No bank would charge a lower interest rate than the settlement balances rate because it could simply earn more interest if it were to leave its money in its reserve account at the central bank. This entire range, or the area between the bank rate and the settlement balances rate, is known as the operating band. The overnight loans rate will be somewhere in between this operating band because of the effects I mentioned that the bank rate and the settlement balances rate have. This weird looking curve is the shape that the demand for reserves curve takes. The line does not go over the bank rate or below the settlement balances rate because no bank would borrow money above the bank rate and no bank would lend money below the settlement balances rate. This is where the zero axis becomes important. If the quantity demanded for reserves is below zero, it is shown graphically as to the left of the zero line. In practical terms, This would mean that the entire banking system is borrowing from the central bank. The central bank's open market operations will determine the actual amount of reserves at the central bank. Just like with any other economic model, there is an equilibrium. The equilibrium occurs where the quantity of reserves at the central bank equals the reserves demanded. This determines the overnight loans rate. The central bank can alter the overnight loans rate by manipulating the amount of reserves. If the overnight rate is higher than the target rate, we arrive at a situation where the reserves in the central bank are lower than they need to be in order to achieve the target rate. The central bank conducts open market operations by buying government securities from banks. The central bank pays commercial banks for these securities by transferring money into their reserves. This in turn increases total reserves and brings the overnight loans rate down. Conversely, if the overnight loans rate is lower than the target rate, the central bank sells government securities. Commercial banks pay for these securities with their reserves, thus decreasing the amount of their reserves. This raises the overnight loans rate to the target rate. Let's move on and talk about the loanable funds market for a little bit. The quantity of investment in an economy is calculated as the amount of savings plus the amount of net taxes minus government expenditure plus the amount of imports minus exports. National savings is what is known as that private saving plus the net taxes minus government expenditure, and foreign borrowing is what is known as imports minus exports. The nominal interest rate is the number of dollars that a borrower pays and a lender receives in interest in a year, as expressed as the number of dollars borrowed and lent. As expressed as a percentage of the number of dollars borrowed and lent. The real interest rate is the nominal interest rate, but it's adjusted to remove the effects of inflation, and is calculated as the nominal interest rate minus the rate of inflation. The real interest rate is the opportunity cost of borrowed funds, because the real interest rate is paid on borrowed funds. Real interest rate is foregone when these funds are used to buy consumption goods or invest in new capital goods. And so that interest rate is not something that you'll get. That is why it's the opportunity cost of not saving or lending those funds. The demand for loanable funds is the quantity of loanable funds demanded, and the total quantity of funds demanded to finance investment, the government budget deficit, and international investment or lending in a given time period. The demand for loanable funds is the relationship between the quantity of loanable funds demanded and the real interest rate. But we have to hold expected profits constant. Let's say that Amazon is expecting $5 million from a $100 million investment. Will they decide to make the investment or not? Will this quantity of loanable funds be demanded or not? Let's take a look. Well, if the interest rate is greater than 5%, then the money that Amazon has to pay to whatever bank it's looking for is actually going to have to be over $5 million. So any profit that they get back is going to be used to pay that interest payment, and so it's not going to be worth it, so they will not demand this $100 million in investment. But if the interest rate is less than 5%, then they will, because we're going to be paying less than $5 million in this interest expense, and so we actually get to retain some amount of that profit. Ceteris paribus. As the real interest rate falls, we're going to see an increase in the demand for loanable funds, the quantity demanded of loanable funds. And as the real interest rate rises, we're going to see a reduction in loanable funds demanded, the quantity of loanable funds demanded. When we talk about changes in the demand for loanable funds, we're going to see changes in the curve. So we're going to see either an increase or a decrease. Anything that changes the expected profit will change the demand for loanable funds. Ceteris paribus. The greater the expected profit from new capital, the greater is the amount of investment, and thus the greater is the demand for loanable funds. But what changes expected profits? One of the things that changes expected profits is the business cycle, the expansions, the recessions. Expansions increase expected profit, and recessions decrease expected profits. Technological change will generally increase demand for loanable funds because it creates profitable new products. A growing population also increases the demand for loanable funds because we have an increase in expected future profits. You have more people, they're going to be buying more stuff, so you're probably going to expect an increase in the profits that you receive in the upcoming year. When we talk about consumer confidence, if consumer confidence in the economy is low, then businesses will have low expected profits. And if consumer confidence is high and consumers are going out and buying stuff, then businesses will expect higher profits. So the demand for loanable funds will increase. The supply of loanable funds, when we talk about it, we're going to be talking about the quantity first. So the quantity of loanable funds supplied is the loanable funds, total loanable funds available from saving, the government budget surplus, and international borrowing during a given time period. When we look at the supply of loanable funds curve, we're going to notice that it's the relationship between the quantity of loanable funds demanded and the real interest rate. And as the real interest rate rises, we have an increase in the loanable funds supplied, quantity of loanable funds supplied, and as the real interest rate decreases, we have a decrease in the quantity supplied of loanable funds. When we talk about a change in the supply for loanable funds, we're talking about an actual shift in the curve. And this rests on four factors, one of which is disposable income, which is equal to a house's income minus its net taxes. When disposable income increases, consumption expenditure does increase, but it's going to increase by less than the amount that the income is increased, because some of this income is saved. And this is what shifts the supply curve. The greater is a household's disposable income, the greater is its savings, and so supply would shift to the right. But if the household's disposable income decreases, then the supply curve will shift to the left because it doesn't have as much money to save. It also depends on expected future income. And we generally say that the higher a household's expected future income, the lower is its current savings. So the higher the expected future income, the greater the decrease in supply. And this happens because consumers gain confidence that, okay, our income is going to increase in the future, so we might as well spend now. What's the point in saving? We're going to earn that money back later. It also depends on wealth. The higher a household's wealth, the less their savings, and this is simply because, again, confidence. If anything happens to me, then I have all these assets that I can sell off and pay off my debt. So why do I need to save? It also depends on default risk, and default risk is the risk that a loan will not be repaid. The greater this risk is, the higher is the interest rate needed to actually induce a person to lend the smaller, and so the smaller is the supply of loanable funds. So, in essence, a greater default risk means a lower supply of loanable funds, and a smaller default risk means an increase in the supply of loanable funds. If the quantity of loanable funds supplied exceeds the quantity of loanable funds demanded, then there's a surplus of loanable funds, and there's downward pressure on the real interest rate. But if the quantity demanded of loanable funds exceeds the quantity supplied, then there's a shortage of loanable funds, and we have upward pressure on the real interest rate, until we reach an equilibrium. When we talk about an increase in demand, what happens? Well, we see a rightward shift of the demand for loanable funds curve. This, number one, increases the quantity of loanable funds demanded and supplied, and it increases the real interest rate. A decrease in demand for loanable funds has the exact opposite effect. We decrease the real interest rate, and we decrease the amount of loanable funds, quantity of loanable funds demanded and supplied at equilibrium. When we increase the supply of loanable funds, we see a decrease in the real interest rate, but we see an increase in the quantity of loanable funds demanded and supplied. So we see an increase in the equilibrium quantity. We see an exact opposite effect when we see a decrease in supply, because the quantity of loanable funds decreases, but the real interest rate rises.